In the day room of Acacia Unit, one of Australia's highest security prison facilities, a man sits reading the newspaper, a gangland figure who orchestrated multiple hits during Melbourne's bloodiest underworld war, now serving 35 years. But today's newspaper has made him the front page story, and in prison, that story has just signed his death warrant. Behind him, in the blind spot of his vision, a hulking figure approaches, a man known throughout the system as the General. Minutes from now, Carl Williams will be dead, and it will all be captured on CCTV. This is the story of Australia's most notorious prison murder. To understand the story, we first need to understand who the General was and what made him different from every other inmate in the system. Matthew Charles Johnson entered the world on August 9, 1973 in Melbourne, and nothing about his start suggested that he'd end up as one of Australia's most feared prisoners. But life had other plans. His father died when he was 6. His stepfather was an aggressive drunk who beat the shit out of him. He gets kicked out of school in year 7, and by 15, he's already bouncing in and out of youth detention. But here's what made Johnson different. While most criminals struggle with prison, Johnson apparently thrived in it. Former inmates describe him as being good at doing jail. He understood the politics, the hierarchies, the unwritten codes that governed life behind bars. By his 20s, he's racked up 167 convictions: burglary, armed robbery, assault. In January 1998, he goes on a spree of armed robberies. During one incident, Johnson entered an elderly couple's home at Safety Beach, Victoria, with a knife. In another, he entered a house and held a knife to a man's throat and threatened to start cutting unless he was given money. After several prison sentences, Johnson gained a reputation in Victoria's prison system for his violent behavior. Johnson found himself in Barwon prison, where he and 4 other inmates decided they've had enough of Gregory Brazel, a serial killer locked up in Acacia Unit. They smashed through a reinforced security glass to get to him and then spent 45 minutes beating him with an exercise bike seat stem, a vacuum pole, and a sandwich maker. They nearly killed him. The trial in 2000 became known as the Trial from Hell. Johnson and his boys showed up to court and threw a bag of human shit at the jury. 2 others dropped their pants and showed their asses to the judge. In the end, all of them were found guilty, and Johnson received more time to his sentence. But something else happened during that trial. Apparently, Johnson realized he had power. He could organize, he could lead, and he understood prison culture better than anyone. And so he founded the Prisoners of War, or the POWs. The group lived by old-school convict values: honor among thieves, hatred of authority, and above all else, an absolute zero-tolerance policy toward informants. Anyone who talked to police was a dog, and dogs, in Johnson's world, deserved to be put down. People started calling him the General. In one letter to another inmate, he wrote, "I am the true General, so I must keep things in good order. I love this shit." By 2010, Matthew Johnson was 36 years old, serving 16 years with a 13-year non-parole period for various crimes, including armed robbery and aggravated burglary. But his most infamous crime was still to come. Now, I know a lot of you on this channel already know about Carl Williams, so we'll just give a brief overview. Born October 13, 1970, Carl Anthony Williams grew up in Broadmeadows, a working-class Melbourne suburb. His family lived in poverty. In the late 1990s, Carl entered Melbourne's amphetamine trade. He'd been a minor player in Melbourne's drug scene until he and his father George found a way to cut out a piece of the market for themselves. They found a way to make cheap party pills by combining ketamine with speed. These weren't pure ecstasy pills, which were harder to get in bulk, but substitutes that worked well enough for the club scene. They called them FUBUs and UFOs. Carl and George started selling them for $15 each. Later, they refined the mix, got 10% more out of each batch, and dropped the price to as low as $8 or $10 a pill. By undercutting established players, Carl was building his drug business fast and making enemies. The Morans couldn't handle that Carl was making cheaper pills by undercutting them by half. And there was another problem. Carl had a pill press that the Morans believed was rightfully theirs. On October 13, 1999, Carl's 29th birthday, the conflict came to a head. The 2 sides met at a reserve in Gladstone Park to settle the dispute. Jason Moran wanted one of 2 things: hand over the pill press or pay $400,000 for it. Carl showed up with just a few $1,000s. The moment Jason saw how little Carl had brought, he pulled out a small .22 revolver and pulled the trigger, hitting Carl in the stomach. he collapsed to the ground. Mark Moran allegedly told his brother to finish the job, but Jason hesitated. Carl survived, and according to him, that gunshot wound ignited what would become known as the Melbourne Gangland Wars. However, shootings were already happening before that, like the executions of Alphonse Gangitano, Charles Hegyalji, and others. Between 1998 and 2010, 36 underworld figures would be executed throughout Melbourne. Mark Moran was executed outside his home on June 15, 2000. Jason Moran and associate Pasquale Barbaro were executed in front of children at an Auskick football clinic in 2003. Jason's father, Louis Moran, was executed at the Brunswick Club in 2004. Mark Mallia and Michael Marshall in 2003. In the end, police believed Carl Williams was responsible for at least 10 gangland executions in total. In 2007, Carl Williams was sentenced to 27 years for Marshall's execution, then hit with a minimum of 35 years for the executions of Louis Moran, Jason Moran, and Mark Mallia, plus conspiracy to execute Mario Condello. He'd be 71 before even being considered for parole. Williams was sent to Barwon Prison's Acacia Unit, Victoria's most secure facility, a prison within a prison. 24-hour CCTV surveillance with the state's most dangerous criminals. But by 2010, to many gangland figures, Carl Williams had become something even more dangerous than a killer. He became a police informant. To understand the lead-up to Carl Williams' execution, you need to know about Terence and Christine Hodson. On May 16, 2004, the couple was found executed in their home with their hands tied behind their backs. Terence was a police informant due to testify about police corruption. His wife Christine had no involvement in crime. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Office of Police Integrity was established. The case centered on allegations of police corruption involving a burglary at a drug stash house. Terence Hodson had been arrested alongside an off-duty drug squad detective and was set to testify. But before he could give evidence, he and his wife were executed. Proving who was behind it was another matter entirely. They needed someone to testify, someone on the inside, and that's where Carl Williams came in. By 2009, facing 35 years in prison, Williams made a decision that would seal his fate. He agreed to cooperate with Victoria Police. The deal was extraordinary. According to the Herald Sun, in exchange for information about the Hodson executions and other unsolved crimes, Williams was set to receive a package that included private school fees paid for his daughter, a tax debt cleared that was owed by his father George, and the possibility of receiving a lesser sentence. According to police statements that became public during court proceedings, Williams provided detailed accounts implicating himself as a middleman in the Hodson executions. He claimed in these statements that a former drug squad detective, Paul Dale, had allegedly paid him $150,000 to arrange the hit, and that he'd hired hitman Rodney Collins to carry out the shootings. Based on Williams' statements, both men were charged, but the charges were later dropped. However, we'll talk about that later in the video. Everyone in Barwon Prison now knew what Carl Williams had become, and he was housed under one roof with Matthew Johnson, a man who had built his entire reputation on the old prison code. Remember, being a dog in prison is the ultimate betrayal, a death sentence waiting to happen. Here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. In 2008, both Carl Williams and Matthew Johnson separately requested to Corrections Victoria that they be housed together. They'd known each other for about 10 years. Williams believed they were friends. Prison staff and top-level government bureaucrats raised alarms. They expressed serious concerns about Williams' safety. Johnson had an extremely violent history, and Carl was now an informant. The prisoners of war gang had an explicit hatred of anyone who cooperated with authorities. The decision to house them together was described by one judge as breathtaking and amazing. Another said, "How the prison authorities permitted that to happen is beyond me." But on January 20th, 2009, Corrections Victoria approved the housing arrangement, trusting Williams' wishes. They were placed in Unit 1 of the Acacia Unit together. Later in 2009, Williams' father George was released on parole. A third inmate joined the unit, Tommy Ivanovich, the godfather of Williams' daughter. Ivanovich was described by Matthew Johnson as being like a brother to Williams. 3 men, 1 small unit, constant surveillance. What could go wrong? For months, nothing did. George Williams would later testify that his son and Johnson got along well. Johnson even told Williams he should get what he could from authorities for his cooperation. But Johnson's attitude shifted after Williams' second meeting with investigators, when Williams went outside the prison to formally sign his statements against Paul Dale and Rodney Collins. Johnson had access to Williams' legal documents. He knew exactly what Carl was telling police. During cross-examination, Johnson admitted that he had accessed Williams' computer and downloaded statements Williams was making against others. Williams was on a prison visit at that exact time, meaning Johnson had stolen and reviewed the documents without his knowledge. Johnson saw the names. He saw what Williams had said. And critically, he claims Williams was also providing information about 6 people Johnson personally knew. The morning of April 19, 2010, Carl Williams woke up to find himself on the front page of the newspaper. The headline revealed that Victoria police were paying his daughter's school fees and had settled a $750,000 tax debt for his father. The article didn't explicitly say why, but in prison, everyone understood what it meant. Williams called his lawyer that morning. He didn't mention any concerns about Johnson or Ivanovich, but Matthew Johnson had read that same article. As one former inmate explained, in prison, being a police informant or a dog immediately qualifies you for merciless attacks from the mainstream prison population. An inmate of Johnson's stature would never be forgiven by the constant chatter of the prison walls if he didn't do something about the dog in his yard, especially when he was being blatantly reminded of the situation on the front page of the newspaper. Johnson would later claim that on April 18th, the day before, Tommy Ivanovich had warned him that Williams was planning to execute him. According to Johnson, Ivanovich said he'd walked in on Williams in his cell, stretching a sock. Williams allegedly told Ivanovich he was planning to fill the sock with pool balls and bash Johnson's head in. The prosecution called this claim fanciful. The judge agreed. So on April 19, 2010, at 12:48 p.m., Carl Williams sat alone at a table in the day room of Unit 1, unarmed, unaware, and completely exposed, reading that newspaper. His back was to his cell door, to the walkway, to his blind spot. CCTV cameras captured everything that happened next. Tommy Ivanovich was in the day room, moving around. Then Matthew Johnson appeared in the background. In his hands was the stem from an exercise bike seat, the same type of weapon he'd used to nearly take out Gregory Brazel years earlier. Then he struck. The first blow hit Williams on the right side of his head. Williams fell to the floor immediately. He never stood a chance. Johnson struck 7 more times and then dragged Williams to his cell and closed the door. 27 minutes later, Johnson approached a prison guard and told her she should press her panic alarm because Williams had hit his head. When guards entered the unit, they found that Carl Williams had passed. Massive head trauma. The exercise bike stem nearby. A copy of that morning's newspaper lying open on the table. It took prison guards 30 minutes to realize one of Australia's most notorious gangland figures had been executed on camera in the country's highest security facility. Matthew Johnson's trial began in late 2011. His defense was simple: self-defense. He claimed Tommy Ivanovich had warned him Williams was going to execute him, so he struck first out of absolute necessity. The prosecution argued the real motive. Johnson executed Williams because Williams was an informant, and Johnson, as leader of the prisoners of war gang, couldn't tolerate a dog in his yard. Secret recordings of Johnson during prison visits were played in court. In one, Johnson told an associate, "I couldn't turn my back on something like that," referring to Williams's cooperation with police. In another, he said Williams had underestimated him and obviously read me wrong. After 14 hours of deliberations over 3 days, the jury of 7 women and 5 men returned their verdict: guilty of murder. Justice Lasry sentenced Johnson to life imprisonment with a 32-year non-parole period. Combined with his existing sentence, Johnson won't be eligible for parole until he's at least 70 years old in 2043. But the legal consequences were just the beginning. Without Carl Williams' testimony, the prosecution case against Paul Dale and Rodney Collins fell apart. In 2010, all charges were withdrawn. The executions of Terence and Christine Hodson remain officially unsolved. Rodney Collins passed in custody in May 2018 at age 72, reportedly from cancer, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. As for Paul Dale, he has consistently maintained his innocence. After the charges were withdrawn, Dale publicly denied any involvement with the Hodgsons and said people should take a close look at the credibility of the person making those claims. He has never been convicted of any offense connected to the case. Carl Williams met his end not in a hail of bullets or a car bomb like most gangland figures, but bludgeoned in the safest prison in Australia, executed by a man he thought was his friend. Thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like and leave a comment on what you'd like to see next. Bye-bye.